Hi everyone, welcome back. This is another S6 history class. As you can see here from the title, where our discussion of the Second World War is coming to an end. But before we close it, we have to reflect on the consequences and effects of this global conflict. We said this in the beginning. The Second World War left in its wake large-scale death and destruction. Over 40 million people, or about 40 billion people killed in total. More civilian deaths than military ones. And the Russians would have the greatest share of this, over 20 million killed. And then, not to mention the other millions and millions upon millions of people who were displaced, who were forced into slave labor, brought to concentration camps or death camps, refugees, those people who had to flee war. Germany lay in ruins, in particular their industrial areas targeted by the Allies. 25 million Russians homeless. In France, sweeping destruction across the country, 50% of wealth lost. In Italy, that's about 30%. And as you're familiar with this estimate of about 5-6 million Jews exterminated, okay, and all the rest, all the other groups, all the other people, who were killed by the Nazis. In contrast to the First World War, there was no single peace settlement after World War II. So separate treaties had to be signed. Why is that? Because the victors, the Allies, distrusted each other. I mean, in particular, the Allies and then Russia. Italy lost its African colonies. They had to give up Albania and Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia. The USSR, triumphant, took parts of Czechoslovakia, Finland, and kept those territories it invaded, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Japan had to give up all the territories that it acquired in the last 90 years. And then they also had to agree to a complete withdrawal from China. Russia refused to agree on, a common settlement on Germany and Austria. They said yes to Allied occupation, but at the same time, they except for this, okay, there was no general agreement except for this and this, the demand that East Prussia had to be divided between Russia and Poland. The Second World War also brought about major social and political changes. So people were forced to move after the conflict. So for instance, in Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, people had to move out of those countries, out of those territories, in order to prevent future German claims. Okay, remember how it started, the Sudetenland. Okay, Austria, this idea of a greater German empire. In order to prevent that from happening in the future, millions of German speakers were forced to move out of these territories. The USSR and Germany, had to focus on rebuilding their cities, rebuilding their economies. Great Britain had to, the end of the war also led to, this idea that Great Britain could become a welfare state. And in many countries, in Scandinavia, in France, in the Balkan region, the old leaders were replaced, especially those who cooperated with the Axis powers. And in their place, you would have the resistance leaders, those who resisted the Nazis and the other Axis powers. Okay, those leaders, they would be put in positions of power in these territories. This is a major development, okay, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we enter the nuclear age. The world would come under the threat of future nuclear war. But at the same time, some people would argue just because of the potential of nuclear weapons to destroy the entire planet. This idea served as a kind of deterrent, that kept the two remaining superpowers from, going at it. So this was a kind of deterrent in the Cold War. So in world affairs, another consequence, Europe's domination would end and the world would see the rise of two superpowers. Germany was devastated, it was divided. France and Italy were on the brink of bankruptcy. For Great Britain, war was too expensive, was too costly. And because of this, they had to take out loans from the US. They would become, in this way, dependent on the Americans. Imagine, Great Britain was a naval power, at the same time a colonial power, but because of the war, they became dependent, economically dependent, financially dependent on the US. A little bit of humiliation there. The US, fortunately for them, they suffered very little action on their own soil. It was advantageous for them to be the supplier of materials, food, and other goods to their allies. And they would come out of this conflict with the largest navy and air force in the world. And on top of that, control of the atomic bomb. The USSR is still a giant, had the largest army at this point, a little bit weakened, but still, a force to be reckoned with. And the distrust between these two powers and the conflicts that they would get into, and they would in a way they would not inspire, but that they would cause, because of this mutual distrust and competition, that would dominate. The Cold War would dominate world politics after 1945, after the conclusion of the Second World War. Now, another effect of World War II. Japan defeated the European powers in Asia, took over their territories, and in effect destroyed this idea and the tradition of European power, of invincibility and rule over Asian territories. So after the Second World War and also the defeat of Japan, it was quite difficult to justify holding on to those colonies. Okay, so you would see the rise of new nation states in Asia, which would in turn intensify claims for independence in other areas in the world, in particular in the Middle East and Africa. Just a brief note, in 1973, these newly independent nation states would declare themselves the third world. Because you have the conflict between communism, capitalism, the USSR and the US. These newly independent states would declare themselves to be, to belong to another register, another category, that they're not aligned with either Russia or the United States. They would see those two powers with suspicion and a bit of resentment, given that they were former colonies. I mean, these independent countries were former colonies, economically weaker, relative to, let's say, the US. So they would resent the dominance of the US, for instance, in world affairs. Lastly, even though the world saw great devastation, a lot of pain, suffering, and death, one positive, very positive outcome for the continent was a move towards cooperation, greater cooperation. The European powers were devastated. The economic difficulties they found themselves in were worse than, the situation after the First World War. And because of this, countries had to move towards closer and greater cooperation if they wanted to recover, if they wanted to be able to crawl out of this desperate situation that they saw themselves in after the global conflict that was the Second World War. Okay, I hope all of this is clear. This concludes our discussion of World War II. And in the next presentations, we're going to focus on, one of those great, quite memorable, but at the same time disturbing aspects of World War II, which is the Holocaust. And in addition to that, we're going to talk about other instances of genocide. I look forward to seeing you in our future presentations, and I wish you a good break. Bye-bye.